Hey guys, how's it going? Today's lesson is going to be on the nervous system. Okay, so I haven't been teaching. I missed the populations because I felt like it was pretty easy and straightforward, and you guys did well on the assignments. So this is a little bit different. The nervous system is a system that involves your brain, your spinal cord, and your peripheral nerves. Okay, so peripheral just means the nerves outside the brain and the spinal cord. So they're found on the periphery or on the outside. And you guys got to know the divisions of the nervous system, okay? And so what does that mean within divisions of the nervous system? Well, I'm going to just show you what the divisions of the nervous system are, and then we're going to diagram it together so everybody understands it, okay? So the nervous system is made up of two key components. So if I was to draw it as a chart, here's your nervous system, okay? You know it's made up of nerves, okay? So a nerve is a type of a cell, and it conducts electrical impulses so you can think and feel and do things like that. So a nerve is a type of cell in your body. And so the nervous system is made up of these nerves, and they're divided into two components, your CNS and your PNS. And when I talk about your CNS, I'm referring to your central nervous system, okay? And when I talk about your central nervous system, I'm talking about your brain and your spinal cord, okay? So your brain and your spinal cord are part of your central nervous system, and these guys are made up of nerves, okay? Now, there are different types of nerves, and we're going to say that the brain is made up of a type of nerve called the interneuron, okay? And so is the spinal cord. It's made up of a type of nerve cell called a interneuron, okay? Now, I then told you that the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system are divided as well, okay? And so it's divided into two parts, and it's divided into the somatic system and the autonomic system, okay? So like the somatic system of the peripheral nervous system is made up of motor and sensory neurons, and the autonomic is made up of parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons. Now, this is going to make no sense because you're like, okay, so here are the divisions of the nervous system. What really helps is if you visualize it, okay? So if you visualize it, okay, and imagine like here's a person, okay, and that's maybe you, right? And that this person has a brain, and this person has a spinal cord, like that, right? And the spinal cord, right? This is the neck, right? And here's the torso. And you can imagine like this is his arm right here with his hands, right? And the hands, right, that this man or this person has, the hands actually have these like endings on them, like this. Okay, and these endings are called receptors. Okay, so if you were to take a look at the skin, okay, so like if this is the layer of your skin, okay, and let's say there's like a pin, and this pin is pressing down on your skin, well, how do you feel the pain of that pin as somebody like pushes it down on your skin? You feel it because you have what are called these receptors, okay? And these receptors are unique because they detect sensation. So they detect stimulus or what we call sensation, okay? So for example, this receptor could be called a baroreceptor because it detects pressure, right? Look, baro is like pressure. You also have other types of receptors. You have like thermoreceptors, and those detect heat. Okay, so if you put your hand on a hot stove, that would be a different kind of receptor that's going to be activated. So you have another type of receptor. So let's say like this is the thermoreceptor, and this one, right? This one is activated when there's heat. And then you have another receptor like this one, and this is the baroreceptor, and this one responds to pressure, right? So you have different types of receptors underneath your skin, right? And so you got to think about that. Like, so here I have one type of receptor, here's another type of receptor, right? And these receptors are part of the nerve cell, okay? So we're going to draw this nerve cell, okay? And we're going to draw it in red. Okay, so here is a nerve cell. Okay, so this entire red structure that I drew is a neuron or a nerve cell. A single nerve cell is called a neuron. And this one that I drew in red is called the sensory neuron. Okay, so what does a sensory neuron do? It senses stimulus or sensations. Sensory means sense, right? And it does that because it has these receptors, which are the specialized endings of the sensory neuron, right? So the receptor is a part of the sensory neuron, right? And this sensory neuron, right, there's other sensory neurons. So like I drew another one in green here. So here's another sensory neuron, okay? That's in green. And you can see that this sensory neuron, like let's say this one is where the thermoreceptor is. So this sensory neuron detected heat. Let's say the red one was the baroreceptor. So this one is the one that detects the pressure. And so all these sensations are now directed up the arm into the spinal cord, right? So that's what the sensory nerve is doing, right? And once it hits the spinal cord, there's a different kind of neuron in the spinal cord. So let's take a look at it. So here it is. Here's another type of neuron, and this is called the interneuron. So do you see how the interneuron, right? So this is your brain, okay? And this long structure that I drew here, that is your spinal cord, okay? And your spinal cord is made up of all these neurons, okay? So all these neurons are in your spinal cord, and they extend into the brain like that, see? And they're called an interneuron, right? Because inter means in between neuron. And also you can see that these interneurons are located exclusively and specifically inside the brain and the spinal cord. So take a look at the chart that I drew. And when I said that there's two parts to the nervous system, and the central and the peripheral, and I said the brain and the spinal cord contain interneurons. And you can see in my diagram, that's true, that the brain has all these interneurons in them, and so do the spinal cord, right? But when I said the peripheral nervous system is everything on the outside of the central nervous system, I divided it into two components, the somatic and autonomic. And guess what? Here is the sensory neuron, right? And the sensory neuron is in fact part of the peripheral nervous system, because you can see that this sensory neuron is found outside of the spinal cord, like most of it. There's a little part of it that's inside the spinal cord so that it can connect to the interneuron, but you can see that any kind of neuron outside the spinal cord is part of your peripheral nervous system, right? Okay, so there we have that, the interneuron and the sensory neuron, right? The interneuron is connected to another neuron, okay, and we're going to draw that here. And that is called, we're going to just, let's see if this can erase this, just this part, this part. And we're going to just erase this part over here. Oh no, my arm got erased. Whatever. Okay, so you guys are, here's the arm right here. And then I drew in pink this other neuron. Okay, just 1 second. I'm just going to draw this neuron a little bit better. Okay, so you can see that when I drew the interneuron, and I don't know why my spinal cord got eliminated, part of it, that in pink I drew another neuron, and this neuron is called a motor neuron. Okay, so it basically goes sensory, motor neuron. And the motor neuron is responsible for movement. Now, do you think the motor neuron is part of the peripheral nervous system or the central nervous system? I'll tell you, it's part of the peripheral nervous system because it's found outside the spinal cord. Like the interneuron is completely, all parts of the interneuron are found inside the spinal cord, the whole structure, right? Each one of these is interneurons, and you can see that the interneuron, the entire structure of that interneuron is found inside the brain. But the motor neuron is found, even though part of it is found inside the spinal cord, most of it is actually found outside, right? And because all of this part is found outside the spinal cord, we then say it's part of the peripheral nervous system. And it's called a motor neuron because motor just means movement. And these motor neurons are attached to like muscles. So imagine that there's a muscle here, right? And so there's a muscle over here. So basically, like, let's say a receptor was activated. Let's say this baroreceptor was activated. Let's say somebody poked you with a pin, right? The receptor detected that pain. That information was sent to the sensory neuron. That information then was sent to the interneuron. And you can see that these interneurons are connected to each other and they go all the way to the brain. Your brain processes the pain. And the motor neuron, right, then takes all that information that's in the brain, and the motor neuron tells that muscle to move, right? And so now you have like this interconnected neural system where like parts are talking to each other and communicating with each other, and then you have movement, right? And so the motor neuron, you can see, is part of your somatic system right here, and that is part of your peripheral nervous system. So when we talk about somatic, we're talking about like voluntary movement, right? We're talking about the fact that if somebody pokes you with the pin, I mean, if you really wanted to, you could get poked and poked and poked, and you'd be like trying to withstand the pain and pain and pain, like somebody dares you not to take your hand away. Well, that's under voluntary control, right? Like you have some kind of conscious control about whether or not you withdraw your hand or not, right? So that's why I say the motor and sensory are voluntary, but there is exceptions because some somatic nerves are actually involuntary. So if we look at this diagram, just so that everybody's completely clear, two divisions of the nervous system, the central and peripheral. We talked about the brain and the spinal cord and how the brain and the spinal cord contain only a specific type of neuron or nerve cell called the interneuron. We talked about the peripheral nervous system, and we did two divisions of the peripheral nervous system, the somatic and autonomic. What I just discussed was the somatic division of the peripheral nervous system. I said these neurons can be voluntary and sometimes they're involuntary, and we're going to talk about the reflex arc in the next lesson and why it's involuntary. And I said like the somatic neurons include the motor neuron and the sensory neuron, and the motor neuron is responsible for movement and the sensory neuron is responsible for detecting sensation, right? And so you can see that on this diagram, right? So it all starts with the sensory neuron to the interneuron and then the motor neuron. But now I have this like other part of the peripheral nervous system that I drew over here, and that's the autonomic system. And what is that? Because that's also part of your peripheral nervous system. Well, we're going to draw that because these are nerves that extend, right? We're going to draw them over here. Okay, and they can come down all the way over here. And you can see that these are your neurons. So these are called your sympathetic neurons. Okay, so this is a sympathetic neuron. And let's say this is another sympathetic neuron. And I also have other neurons that extend out of the spinal cord, and they're going to be called my parasympathetic neurons. So here we go. Parasympathetic neuron. And here's another one, parasympathetic neuron. Okay, now these guys that I drew, you guys can see they have to be part of my peripheral nervous system because they're found outside the spinal cord, like the part of their neurons are found outside of the spinal cord. And what do? Well, because they're part of the autonomic nervous system, autonomic refers to being automatic, meaning you don't have to think about it. So your sympathetic neuron, okay, can connect to your, oh, look, there's your heart, right? Oh, look, there's your lungs, right? So you can see like this sympathetic neuron, right, is connected to your heart. And you also have like a parasympathetic neuron that is also connected to your heart. So we can draw that over there. And here's a parasympathetic neuron that's connected to your lungs. Now, what is the function of the sympathetic and parasympathetic neuron? Well, the sympathetic neuron functions when you're stressed. And the parasympathetic neuron functions when you want to rest and digest, okay? So really important that these two, parasympathetic and sympathetic, have opposite functions. This is when you rest and digest, and this is when you're stressed, okay? These are two neurons. And remember to distinguish them from somatic, right? Somatic is under voluntary control for the most part, and autonomic occurs automatically, so you don't have to think about it. And remember, the neurons that are somatic are the motor and the sensory, and the nerves that are autonomic are parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, so imagine if you're stressed, right? Like imagine there's like a dog barking at you and it starts chasing you. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to have extreme stress, right? And this sympathetic neuron that I drew in gray is going to tell your heart to speed up. And so your heart does that automatically. It's not like when you see a growling dog at the end of a driveway and he's that you say to your heart, oh my gosh, speed up. Your heart does it on its own, right? So there you have it. An automatic nerve called the sympathetic nerve is responsible for your heart speeding up, right? And then you have a parasympathetic nerve. So let's say you ran away from the dog successfully and the dog is like gone. Well, now you're at home and you're resting, right? Oh, and now because you're resting, it's your parasympathetic nerve that's telling your heart to slow down, right? And so they have like opposite functions. Sympathetic nerve tells your heart to speed up, tells your breathing to increase the breathing, right? To deal with this stressful situation. This parasympathetic neuron will say decrease breathing once the stress has passed. And your heart does that, speeds up and slows down automatically. So it's part of the autonomic system. And that's part of our peripheral nervous system because you can see that these neurons are extending outside the spinal cord like that. Okay? So these are the divisions of the nervous system, and this is what they mean. Basically, when you are resting, you are also digesting. So like basically when you are running away from a dog, you're not worried about eating, right? But once the threat has passed, you start digesting the food. And that's because your blood is rerouted to your muscles when you're stressed, to your brain and your muscles, because you're stressed and you need to run. But then once the stress has passed, the blood comes back to your stomach and you start getting hungry and you get growling. And so that's how these nerves work. Okay, so there we go. Those are the divisions of the nervous system. The next lesson will be on the reflex arc and the part